Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 13 of our topics in public administration. Just a couple of administrative notes before we get started on today's topic. This is the second to last chapter in the textbook that we're using. This week will be the penultimate lecture, and then next week we will have our last lecture of the semester with connected to chapter 12. I want to remind you that in this class, in this course, the final examination consists of a research paper, an in-depth researched and cited research paper, and you can find details about that in the week 15 folder on Moodle. Because we're 3 to 4 weeks away, just a little over 3 weeks away now from that paper being due. It's really incumbent on you to start thinking about that, get started on it. And if you have any questions or concerns or want to talk through the topics that you want to be researching and writing about, I really encourage you to give me a call or send me a message this week, and let's set aside some time to talk about it so that you feel comfortable about getting the research paper done. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, please pick up that 1,000-pound phone and give me a call or send me an email, and we'll find a way to connect as soon as possible so that I can be of help and service to you. This week, our topic is called Government Regulation and Administrative Law. And, regulating business and society is a long-standing and often a controversial aspect of government and the work that government does. During the 20th century, especially, regulation has become even more extensive, not only at preventing certain practices and prohibiting certain actions, but also regulation has required that certain operating standards be met. Scores of statutes have created dozens of new regulatory agencies, and regulations touch nearly every aspect of our lives today, whether it's transportation safety rules or rules regarding the food that we eat, medications that can be used to treat diseases, regulations and rules regarding air quality and water quality, rules about work conditions, healthcare related regulations. These are just a few areas where we've seen huge growth in the regulatory process at national and even a local level as well. And if we look at local regulations, I'm sure you have had experience with building codes and zoning laws, housing regulations, employment regulations. There are just so many diverse areas where regulations touch our lives. Some people argue that regulations interfere with the free market competition in our economy and hurt both producers and consumers. But others have argued, saying a lack of regulations would actually increase costs in the marketplace and limit competition and actually lower the quality of goods and services being produced and offered to the public. In addition to regulations, there's a body of administrative law that has grown, and their role is to interpret and help enforce regulations today by using legal channels and legal tools in the administrative process. So we're going to look today at a little bit about the history of government relations, how it's regulations, how it's happened, and the social regulatory process today, how regulations are actually created and the structure of them, and a little bit about the politics of regulation in today's 21st century marketplace. Your book does a really good job of talking about the history of regulations, and I'm certainly not going to go into great detail on that for those of you who are interested in the historical aspects. I really commend the first half of this chapter to you. It's a very interesting history of government regulations. But I think it is important to point out a couple of key things that it's incumbent on all of us to understand as we talk about this regulatory and administrative process. When we look back in America's history, historically, government regulations were really created early in America's uh, tenure to either limit the practices or regulating of prices for commercial goods and services. Regulation was about regulating prices and keeping the economy growing. And early in the late 18th and early 19th century, there were regulations that would promote commerce by using incentives and grants and subsidies. The purpose was to grow America's economy, and regulations were used for those economic purposes. When we look at the Constitution, where Congress and the executive derive their powers, the Constitution grants exclusive authority to Congress to regulate commerce. But even though Congress was granted this power, in fact, early in America's tenure, the states actually did most of the regulating until the mid 19th century, shortly after the Civil War. When the Industrial Revolution came about, government stepped in and started increasing the regulations. And those regulations grew in the late 19th and into the early 20th century. Some of the first major regulatory actions we saw came about with the first regulatory agency that was created, and that was the Interstate Commerce Commission in the late 1800s. And the role of those regulations, or the purpose, was to do just what the namesake says, to regulate commerce that was occurring between the states. States were competing with each other, and because of high prices and poor competition, especially in the railroad industry that had grown during the Industrial Revolution, the government thought and found that dealing with all of these pricing issues on a case by case basis was just becoming too unwieldy. And so instead of dealing with cases on or issues on a case by case basis, the Interstate Commerce Commission was set up to create a set of rules and standards that all railroad industries across the country were to follow. So that standardization allowed rules and regulations to derive that benefited to competition in the marketplace and helped America's economy to grow during the Industrial Revolution. Other laws that regulated commerce were created, and that created other regulatory commissions and agencies. The regulatory commissions came about or were given birth to as a result of laws that were passed that were regulating commerce. For example, in the late 18th century, the Antitrust Act was created or became law, and that created the antitrust division of the U.S. Justice Department. So a legal regulatory commission, if you will, that their purpose was to go after and prosecute anyone or any companies violating this Antitrust Act. Other economic acts like the Clayton Act were passed to prevent price fixing and price discrimination. And as part of that law to prohibit price discrimination, the Federal Trade Commission was established, and they were given the regulatory oversight to make sure that price discrimination didn't occur. Other types of agencies like that followed. If you go even to the Navajo Nation website, you can see listings of many of the Navajo Nation's regulatory agencies, whether it's the Department of Health or the Gaming Commission, just to name a couple. There are, very many regulatory agencies that help to administer the day-to-day operations of the Navajo Nation's government. Today, when we look at the national government, uh, it's just so large and so complex that Congress, in and of themselves, can't be the overseer or the policeman single-handedly to create all these regulations and oversee them. And so, what they have done is they have granted powers to regulate regulatory bodies, and these regulatory bodies have the authority to propose and to create regulations. Now, Congress still retains the oversight of all regulatory agencies, and these agencies have to go before Congress and give reports and answer questions when there are problems in regulations. But by and large, Congress has granted the authority to regulatory agencies to establish these rules. And I'll talk a little bit about that more just a little later on. So, what we've seen in this rise of government regulation is a big shift away from economic regulation that focused on commerce and market growth and price controls to more of a regulatory uh, uh, um, uh, point of view or philosophy, where now this older style has gone away, and today's regulatory agencies focus more on not just the details of the markets or rates, but more on the conditions surrounding markets and rates under which goods and services are produced. The regulatory agencies today focus on the characteristics of goods being manufactured today. And so it really has moved away from regulating prices to more regulating details of the creation and manufacture of products to create a safer environment for citizens. This kind of shift away from the old regulatory environment to this new, what's called social regulation system, began actually in the late 1950s and early 1960s, as citizens were becoming more concerned about what was happening in their environment. In the 1950s, 1960s, there was a big concern about the rise of carcinogens in the environment, whether it was new research that showed how dangerous smoking is to regulations that would limit the dumping of toxic wastes in lands and in waterways. Because people were becoming sick. Even clusters of communities demonstrated higher levels of cancer. And these scientifically proven phenomena concerned the citizenry. And so governments started to respond to that. And whether it was carcinogens or pollution, the government responded by regulating more than just economic issues. The issues became more social in nature, wanting to improve the quality of life. There are some examples of the old and new regulatory agencies in your textbook, and here's some examples that I put on the PPT slide as well. And as you can see, these older agencies they had an authority basically to regulate prices and market shifts But today you can see with, say, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau or the Food and Drug Administration or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, that these agencies were designed to protect consumers' interests and to set conditions for manufacturers or industries to act, and characteristics on which they were to uh, be required to manufacture, produce, or provide services. So a big shift in the nature of regulations. Why has government regulation actually grown and developed? Some argue that there's been a huge expansion of regulatory agencies as a way for the bureaucracy to actually expand their control, especially over private sector enterprises. This is a perennial argument that you hear from industries saying, we have too many regulations, it's killing us, it's hurting our profits. Others have argued that government is actually responding to the growing social needs of our citizenry, to protect citizens, to create a level playing field in our society, and to make sure that there's a continued decrease in dishonesty and corruption in industry and in public administration of the industries. If you look at successive government administrations from the 1950s forward to today, many administrations have tried to streamline government and reduce the regulatory overkill, they call it, too much regulations, too many regulations. And we've seen a pendulum shift back and forth. Some government administrations really reducing regulations, and others stepping in and regulating or re-regulating in particular areas. And I'll give some examples of that in just a few moments. So how do regulations come about? What's the process for creating regulations? It really doesn't matter what government agency we look at. All government agencies and their regulatory processes share some things in common. We can see common elements among all agencies. First, all agencies get their authority to regulate from Congress. That's where the Constitution grants the actual authority to Congress, and so it is Congress that delegates that responsibility to these regulatory agencies. Congress has also created a great deal of overlap between multiple agencies. So some agencies' authorities overlap with one another, and that tends to sometimes to create confusion or lack of understanding. Let me give you an example. The Federal Trade Commission and the Food and Drug Administration and even the Federal Communications Commission each have their own regulatory environments in which they regulate sales or marketing or advertising, and whether it's cigarettes or alcohol, we've seen big changes in what the Federal Trade Commission allows in terms of selling products. The FDA, Food and Drug Administration, regulates what products are safe and whether they've gone through safety standards. And the Federal Communications Commission regulates whether marketing and advertising can be done on TV and radio. Back in prehistoric days when I was a kid, cigarettes were huge advertisers. The manufacturers, everyone saw so many cigarette advertisements, and the Marlboro Man, the cowboy who smoked Marlboro cigarettes, was a cultural icon 50, 60 years ago, and even today still retains an iconic status. But you don't see any cigarette advertisements today, and the Food and Drug Administration has regulated and requires that cigarette packages must contain safety wording that tells consumers how dangerous smoking cigarettes is. The Federal Trade Commission limits how cigarettes can be transported across state lines and taxed. And so there's a great deal of overlap with that. We can look at the same thing with alcohol and many other products where there are many agencies who have overlap in the regulatory environment. A third key element that is common to all these agencies is that they are subject to political influence. And that political pressure, regardless of who the political party in power in Congress and the executive is, these regulatory agencies may be the focus of political influences more from one political party than another. And we've seen that especially in the last 20 or 30 years, and we'll continue to see that as well. There are a couple of different types, if you will, of regulatory agencies. The first is what we would call dependent regulatory agencies. And these are agencies that actually sit and fall within the purview of a cabinet level department. So, for example, the Department of Health and Human Services has a secretary and leaders appointed by the president. But the Food and Drug Administration, or you may know from recent news like the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, these are regulatory agencies whose heads are appointed by the president, but who are actually monitored and managed by the Department of Health and Human Services. So they are a dependent regulatory agency. They fall under a cabinet level department. The other type of regulatory agency is what we would call an independent regulatory commission, or IRC. Independent regulatory commissions are agencies that are a commission, a group of board members. And those board members are appointed at staggered terms. So a president may appoint maybe one or two or three members of a commission during their administration. And the rules often require that political parties must be fairly balanced. And so if there are 4 Democrats and 2 Republicans on the current election commission, for example, then even though President Biden is a Democrat, he would be required to appoint someone who is politically aligned with the Republican Party in order to keep a balance on those commissions. And unlike these dependent regulatory agencies that whose heads are appointed by the president, even the president can appoint members of commissions, but once they are appointed, the president has no power to fire them or to eliminate their positions. There's a bright line or a wall that's created, a barrier there, and these commissioners have a fixed term that is not set in conjunction with a political administration. And so, and then as a commission, they have a role trying to make collective decisions, and that makes the commission a fairly more conservative, if you will, that it's going to be more unlikely for big changes in a commission, an agency commission, to occur during a presidential administration. These are separate board run like agencies, and they're less subject to political influence. The Federal Election Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. These commissions are boards, independent boards, and they operate separately of the executive branch. Now, they do have to report to Congress, but they have far less political pressure placed on them than do, say, the dependent regulatory agencies like the Center for Disease Control or the Food and Drug Administration. So how do regulations get made? What are the procedures for making regulations? Well, um, Congress will pass a law, for example, and they will say they delegate the authority to particular agencies to make rules or to enact regulations uh, consistent with the law to carry out the law, to put the law into effect. And so the agency then has the responsibility to propose how the law is going to be executed. The agency makes these regulatory proposals, and they're required to go through a process that allows citizen input. They start by making a notice of proposal, and that notice of proposed rules is published in a public record called the Federal Register, and it establishes a set of proposed ideas for regulations and gives a time period for public and industry to make comments for the agency to consider. And then after receiving those comments and maybe holding some agency hearings, then they will create the final set of rules. And those final rules actually become law. They are codified or put into a code book called the Code of Federal Regulations, also known as the CFR. And that Code of Federal Regulations has the same power of law as the as Congress passing a law itself. So the codes are made, and the agency is responsible for executing and overseeing that industries or the relevant citizenry follows these regulations. Um, they often get the word out about how things are going to be administered through what they call the adjudication process, and that adjudication process can be more informal in nature or much more formal, where the administration and its administrative law elements in the agency who hear the testimony and make the recommended changes then get that information out to the public and out to industry and begin applying those regulations. They for more formally the agencies through their adjudication process will issue announcements through either written opinions called advisory opinions, and those have the same say impact or effect that a judge writing a case uh, um, will have. Those advisory opinions or written opinions that industry and citizens can rely on as this is how the rule operates, this is what the rule means. In addition, members of the regulatory agency, often leaders, will go out to the public and through trade conferences, speeches, and presentations and seminars, international conferences, they will give speeches or they will make presentations. And it's there that these leaders will say, this is how we are going to regulate this industry, or these are the changes that we are making in the rules. And then finally, there's what's called the consent order, where, especially with complex or you know, uh, issues or regulations that are a little confusing, or the industries don't like what's happening, they will negotiate. The regulatory agency will negotiate between industry and the agency, and they will make some agreements and they will codify those. They will put them in writing in what's called a consent order. And these consent orders have the same practice or practical effect as law that says this is what we've agreed to, and the industry will follow these regulations accordingly. And so, whether advisory opinions or trade conferences or consent orders, this is how the regulations, after they've been published in the Code of Federal Regulations, get disseminated out to industry and for the citizens to have an understanding of. You know, it sounds like this is maybe a non-political process where these agencies follow certain rules and they go step by step, but there is politics involved in regulation. Now, the politics of regulation uh, is rarely politics related to Democrat or Republican politics. When we talk about politics here, politics as a word defined means the practice of negotiating and settling conflicts. And the politics of regulation is instead about how the stakeholders, those who are touched by or connected to these regulations, whether industries or citizens, how they have access to the decision makers and influencers in the agencies. And if industry has a lot of power and influence with the leaders of the agencies, there's politics at play here. The art of negotiating and making change to these regulations that has nothing to do with being a Democrat or a Republican, but is very political in nature, where these politics are highly influential. There's also politics involved with the appointment of these agency leaders and commissioners and the staff that they employ. And the president has a hand in making those appointments to commissions and to regulatory agencies. But rather than making appointments based on political party, they often, or most often, look at areas of expertise. So let's say the head of the Center for Disease Control is a physician, someone who is an expert in public health, for example. The head of the Food and Drug Administration, maybe a scientist or someone who is an expert in the field of drugs or regulation of agriculture industries. And so and there's definitely politics at play, not Republican or Democrat, but politics at play. In addition, Congress still has oversight of these agencies. And so the congressional oversight committees uh, and the influence that they have is political in nature, and the politics or the influence of the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, that actually produces the budgets for these agencies, is political in nature. The president controls this agency, the Office of Management and Budget. And so, there is politics at play in the budgeting process and the political elements of funding these agencies. The president does have some influence with these agencies. As I mentioned, the president appoints the heads of these agencies and can actually fire the heads of direct regulatory agencies. If the president doesn't like the head of the FDA or the CDC, they can be fired and then replaced. Now, commission members cannot be fired, but and whether it's in a direct regulatory agency or in an independent commission, the key day-to-day workers, the bureaucratic employees who staff these agencies and carry out the daily work, are civil service employees, and they go to work for these agencies because of often their passion for this particular industry or topic and wanting to make a difference in the environment or in the social environment. And so that's not necessarily political in nature. Um, if if you saw some news, read some news this weekend, you may have seen an article where a member of former President Trump's administration was appointed to a position at the let's see, I think it was the National Security Agency, which is underneath the Department of Defense, or the Department of National Intelligence today. And this very political person was appointed to be the head general counsel or top lawyer for the NSA, this defense agency, and it was a very, very political appointment and made right before former President Trump left office. And the day that President Biden became president, the head of the National Security Agency put that person on administrative leave, not allowing him to work as head counsel for the NSA. And in the news I read this past weekend, he just finally resigned. He's gone. And this kind of political influence and pressure can even be put on civil servants when politics plays a role. Um, you know, there's almost no oversight of the workers in the day-to-day workers in these commissions or agencies. They operate very independent of the administrative branch or the executive branch. The one exception is that the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, which makes the federal budget every year based on the president's direction, they do have influence in funding these agencies. And so there is some presidential influence in that regard. Congress retains a lot of influence through the fact that they are the ones who approve the budget. They have the oversight and they have the constitutional power to appropriate monies to every branch and every agency. And so they have political power to grant or withhold financial support to these agencies. They also retain oversight and control, of course, these agency budgets. And congressional committees meet periodically and hold hearings with the heads of these agencies to oversee their work, to call them to Congress and get updates. Again, if you've seen the news in the past year, you've seen how many times people like Dr. Fauci has been called in front of Congress to give reports and oversight. Committees oversee that. Again, if you saw the news this past weekend, you know there was a big issue last Friday when Dr. Fauci was giving his testimony at a congressional hearing. I can't remember which congressional oversight committee it was, but the chairman of, or the minority ranking member of that committee was raking him over the coals and treating him with great disrespect, and it made the news. And another member of Congress got into a shouting match with that Congress member and told him to shut up and leave Dr. Fauci alone. And the head of the congressional committee jumped in, and it became a really political shouting match. But congressional committees have a fair amount of power to oversee and regulate what those agencies can and can't do. There are also industry influences. One big criticism of agencies is that they are way too influenced by the industries that they're supposed to be regulating. Take for example, the pharmaceutical industry. The Food and Drug Administration is responsible for seeing whether drugs are allowed to be released on an emergency basis or a trial basis, or whether they can be released for particular uses without any emergency authorization. And the pharmaceutical industry spends, you know, billions of dollars in lobbying and influencing and advertising and marketing to try to influence the power of the Food and Drug Administration. And there are citizens groups that have arisen to try to uh, put put checks on these industries. Citizens groups like Common Cause have tried to hold agencies and industries both more accountable by reporting what they are doing or what they're trying to do, reporting those in the media and to Congress, and to shed light on some of these backroom deals that are made between industries and agencies. And uh, some groups, industry or citizen groups like Common Cause, have had great deal of success at bringing certain things to light and making changes. In the 1970s and 1980s, Common Cause, led by Ralph Nader, who had run for president many times over the last 30 years, this nonprofit organization brought to light so many issues that then helped to regulate and bring more safety to, for example, the automobile industry, where seat belts were then were required in cars, where they did tests on highway safety. They through their periodical called Consumer Reports, they rate or rank products by safety and other measurement tools, and that helps citizens to feel more comfortable and safe. And they've done great service to the citizenry. This consumer movement has had a huge impact on using Congress and the agencies to put pressure on some of these industries for changes. We've seen changes in toy safety and automobile safety and the regulation of drugs. You see regulation changes in the legality of marijuana on a state by state basis. The federal government still has laws that call marijuana a controlled substance, but I think there are 29 or maybe 32 states, even maybe as many as 40 today, where marijuana is allowed for, at the very minimum, for medical purposes, and in many states for recreational purposes. If memory serves me correctly, in this last New Mexico legislature, the medical marijuana laws were modified, and recreational marijuana will be available in New Mexico sometime in the very near future. And this is as a result of consumer movements today. Um, how much regulation is too much, though? This is something that we hear a lot from industries, especially. These regulations are killing us. We spend more time filling out the paperwork, and we're losing money and profits because of this. And so we've seen many administrations who've tried to deregulate industries, and the result has been a mixed bag. Um, on the plus side, if you will, we've seen the deregulation of the airline industry, where they were highly regulated, and the selling of tickets was very highly regulated. In the 1980s, deregulation created more competition, created more airlines, brought prices down, and consumers benefited tremendously from this. So deregulation does have some benefits. On the con side, we saw in again the 1990s and early 2000s the deregulation of the financial industry, where banks and wealth management companies um, were deregulated, and they were given much more freedom to compete with one another in the financial industry. And that financial deregulation we know today led to these banks taking way too many risks, and they were the ones that caused the global financial crisis in 2009 that almost brought down the US economy, were it not for the government stepping in to the tunes of hundreds of billions of dollars to bail out the financial industry and to start some re-regulation once again. There are definite drawbacks to regulation where if industries are not kept in check, they want to make profits, and pollution or other financial disasters be damned. And that's a real issue that we have lived through in just the recent past. So, is re regulation more in the cards? We just got through 4 years of a conservative Republican presidential administration that tried to deregulate in certain areas and cut back regulations and rules. And the current new presidential administration is going through and trying to re-regulate in many areas, and we see examples of that in the news all the time, whether it's with regard to immigration and how people are allowed in through the southern border, to the regulation of 3D guns, guns that are being manufactured in garages using the 3D printing technologies. These kinds of regulations are coming back, and it tends to be that deregulation occurs more with Republican administrations, and re-regulation occurs with more Democratic administrations. So, what's going to happen in the next 4 years with the current Democratic, more progressive administration that wants to cut back on emissions and help climate change? If the Congress doesn't pass laws, then the administration will use its executive powers to regulate or to create executive orders that then create regulations that may grow into a huge octopus once again. We don't know, but it's something that is an ongoing issue for us. Those are really the key points that I want you to understand about this regulation and regulatory process. There are a number of discussion questions at the end of this chapter. I don't want you to have to answer all 10 of them, but there are 4 questions there in the discussion questions worth your contemplating, and that I would like to read your analysis and your opinions about. So please take some time to write answers to discussion questions numbers 1, 4, 8, and 10. Use your own words as much as possible. If you're taking quotes from the book or from other sources, cite those sources and upload your answers into the discussion questions link in the Week 13 folder on Moodle. 2 other homework assignments for this topic. I'd like you to find a recent news article about a U.S. agency, any agency, and any regulation or change, and read that article and summarize and give your analysis. It doesn't need to be a long analysis. 1 to 2 pages is great. Make sure it's minimum of 1 page. Give me a link to the article that you found and read so that I can read it as I read your summary, and upload that in the articles link that's in the Week 13 folder. And then the big homework I'd really like you to focus on this week is I'd like you to go to the Navajo Nation website, and I've posted that web address in the Week 13 folder, in the tab or the homework tab that's marked assignment. I want you to go to the Navajo Nation website. Look at and choose any agency that's of interest to you and that you want to learn more about. I want you to write a summary of that agency. What do they do? How do they regulate on the Navajo Nation? Give some examples of the regulations. And then I'd want you to share your point of view. Do you think those regulations are working or not working? Do they need to be changed? How would you want to change them? What kinds of regulations do you think that agency needs to focus on? This is your opportunity to be, a good citizen and share your input and your ideas to help make the Navajo Nation agencies more responsive based on the areas that you're interested in. I'd like you to upload that essay that you write in the Week 13 folder in the assignment link. If you do any outside readings about the Navajo Nation website or the agency other than the Navajo Nation website, please make sure you cite those sources. Your essay needs to be, I think the assignment calls for a minimum of 5 paragraphs, so an introduction and at least three paragraphs of analysis and a conclusion. The more you write, of course, the more credit that I'll give you, but the minimum requirements is 5 paragraphs. And I really look forward to reading your opinions and ideas about the Navajo Nation regulatory agencies and where you see the strengths and weaknesses are. This is directly related, obviously, to your major as public administration students and gives you a chance to look at an agency that's of interest to you and to give me your ideas and feedback and input. Those are the key things I'd like you to focus on in this week's topic. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to let me know. Give me a call. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. In the interim, have a great week. Good luck on getting the work done. Start thinking about your final paper. And if you want some ideas or you're a little concerned or confused about this final paper, give me a call. It's a big assignment, and so read through that assignment in the Week 15 folder and become familiar with it. And if you're feeling like it's overwhelming, give me a call or let's talk about this and make sure that we get you directed in a way that you see that you'll be able to be successful in writing this final paper, which is due on Monday, May 10th. Have a great week. Hope you stay safe. Take care. We'll talk to you, I hope, really soon. Bye-bye.